Why does public transit keep costing the government more money? Why is cheaper goods the same thing as higher pay? And why don't most people have pensions anymore? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from an empty streetcar that is nonetheless considered a success by the government because it employs a unionized operator. It's becoming more common knowledge that it's really hard to build public transportation infrastructure because of lots of different regulatory problems, high prices, government land use regulations, and things like that. But actually, if you look at the costs of transit, the cost to operate the systems after they're built is also soaring out of control. And it seems like the culprit, again, is government. On the show today, we have Marc Scribner. He is Senior Transportation Policy Analyst at Reason Foundation. He's got a new paper out about this very topic. It's a story of government incentives gone wrong and how ignoring economic principles actually leads to bad results in the real world. So thanks so much for being here, Marc.
Thank you for having me, Dominic.
So I guess to start it off, your paper's about the labor productivity in transit. Can you describe just really quickly what labor productivity means and how that's measured for transit workers?
Yeah, sure. So my paper covers a few different measures of productivity, but one I focused on is one that's put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that's on specifically their measure of transit labor productivity. And how they measure that is they divide an index of output, and they use passenger miles traveled on urban transit systems by an index of hours worked by transit agency employees. And they've been publishing that. It's a relatively recent addition to their catalog, but they've been publishing that since 2018, and they have calculated data so far going back to 2007.
And this problem was known before 2007, right? You talk about how there's been research for decades about how productivity in urban transit has been declining and has been a problem ever since Congress really got involved in this in the 1960s.
Yeah, there's a lot of historical measurements of transit system productivity going back to the 70s and 80s, when a lot of people started to get very concerned about declining productivity in the face of rising government subsidies. A lot of times that was measured in bus hours divided by real dollars, because they were back then, especially going back to the 1960s, this was before San Francisco BART and WMATA in Washington, D.C., those heavy rail systems had been built. So really what they were looking at were the legacy of the old private streetcar companies that had since been converted into diesel buses. So that was the principal measurement back then. But yes, they started, in the face of these rising subsidies, and beginning in 1964, when the federal government first started directly subsidizing transit as the private transit industry was going bankrupt. And then through the 70s, after, in addition to capital subsidies, they authorized operating subsidies for transit systems. Research, and a lot of this was concentrated in the 1980s, began really looking at these questions of productivity and what are the causes of declining productivity.
So a private transit system probably sounds weird to a lot of listeners today. We just take it for granted that the government runs these things. But most of these systems, the really old ones anyway, they were started as private companies and ran that way for many years, right?
Yeah, until the 1960s, most transit systems in the country were privately provided. Most of them began as streetcar companies that operated under franchises with cities. And then beginning in the 1930s, when the diesel bus technology matured and was much cheaper to operate and maintain as well as procure, they began converting those decrepit streetcar systems over to bus systems. But yes, they were. It's important to remember what we call public transportation in this country until for the majority of its history had been by and large privately provided.
And so it sounds a little bit like Ronald Reagan's old line of, if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. And that seems to be the government's approach to transit systems. Since those subsidies started coming in the 1960s, you had mentioned that initially they said these will only be subsidies for capital projects, and then they changed and started doing subsidies for operating costs. Can you explain what the difference is there and why that was such a problem?
Yeah, so back when the private transit companies were going bankrupt in the 60s, and that caused Congress to respond with the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964, which provided federal funding to states and localities to take over those bankrupt transit companies. The theory, or the dominant theory back then, was that customers had been fleeing transit because the systems were in a state of good repair. So if we were to, and they weren't collecting enough fares to cover capital refurbishment. So the infrastructure and the rolling stock, the buses and rail cars. So the transit companies couldn't afford to do that. So the theory was, if we subsidize their capital procurements, then people are going to come back to transit and everyone will be happy. Because at that time, at least in the early mid 60s, while fares weren't sufficient to cover capital refurbishment, they were able to cover operating costs. So that was the theory at the time. And I talk a little bit about it in the paper, but I think it was fundamentally misdiagnosing the cause of the decline in transit. It really was not about people saying, "Oh, that bus is pretty junky." It was much more due to the fact that that people after World War II, coming over the war, they were seeing rising incomes. They wanted more space. They were moving into the suburbs, and just as importantly, they were buying cars. And soon after, people began, we saw this boom in suburban living. Jobs began migrating out there. So you started seeing people increasingly, and now it's the most common, sort of commute pattern is living in the suburbs and commuting to a job in the suburbs. And that's just fundamentally not a travel pattern that can be well served by transit. So between 1945 and 1960, we saw a 60% decline in transit ridership across the country. So, spoiler alert, these capital subsidies did not bring people back to buses and trains. They may have slowed the decline, but if people have already left, if they've already moved out to the suburbs, bought in cars, they weren't coming back. And that's why if you look at ridership data from 1960 until immediately pre-pandemic, ridership nationwide was basically flat.
And this is a great example, too, of government working at cross purposes with itself, because the government also, in the federal government, in the case of interstate highways, helps to pay for the roads, and then it gives them away for free. And so if the government is spending all of that money on roads, enabling people to drive and then not charging them for using them, except for, the fuel tax, I suppose. That comes out to be you're creating incentives for more people to drive at the same time you're trying to create incentives for them to take transit. And so I think you're right that it's pretty clear that people's preferences were for driving, and so having effectively two different ways that the government is encouraging you in both directions really didn't make any sense.
Yes, although I think it's important to note, one, the trend toward the suburbs predates the interstate highway system. And then the interstate highway system, and until fairly recently, the Highway Trust Fund ran a surplus, and it was built. Now it was constructed with a 90% federal share, but it was built on a pay-go basis. So primarily fuel tax revenue that was deposited or credited to the Highway Trust Fund, and then used to fund construction of the interstate. It wasn't running deficits, so it wasn't it was not subsidized in the same way that transit was being subsidized. It was based on user tax collections, despite the fact that yes, they were not paying for sort of external costs like congestion and things like that. Although when the interstate system was built, there was very little congestion on it. That came later.
So basically, the cost that drivers pay to the government through the fuel tax comes a lot closer to actually covering the cost to the government of providing the roads than the price that transit users pay at the fare box in order to cover the government's costs to provide transit. And when you factor on top of that the declining productivity of labor in the transit sector, you're just coming to basically ever more government spending for basically the same amount of transportation provided. You talk about how the ridership numbers really haven't responded very much at all to all of this extra money, and then COVID factored it on top of it, changing people's commuting patterns has only created an occasion for even more government support because they're coming up even shorter than they were before.
Right. Yeah. So from 1960 until 2019, so the year before COVID hit, transit ridership was basically flat. The number of rides taken, unlinked passenger trips taken by transit, basically flat, despite the population growing substantially from 1960 to 2019. So by 2017, when the National Household Travel Survey measured this, and this was the immediate one prior to the pandemic hitting, transit's nationwide mode share, so market share in passenger travel was about 2.5% of trips. Compare that to automobile, it's 85% plus. And I think it's also, I don't get into the paper, but one thing you often hear from certain transit advocates is that transit, despite these steep productivity declines, is that it's somehow underfunded. Transit in this country, spending on surface transportation by all levels of government, so combining total highway and transit spending, transit gets more than a quarter of that funding in order to provide pre-pandemic 2.5% of trips. It's now, after the pandemic hit, we're under 2%. We're closer to 1.5% of trips today that are taken by transit. So we spend a lot of money to get very little out of it. And it's also, it's important to note that transit is really, the median American takes transit 0 times per year. There are a few places in this country where it matters. The main one being the New York City metropolitan area, where almost half of all U.S. transit trips take place. So I've got a chart in there looking at the top 10 cities. The top 10 cities, that's account for 75% of U.S. transit trips, and New York alone is 46.1%. So it's pretty, it's a niche mode, but with some concentrated use in a handful of cities, especially New York.
Sounds like a good issue for federalism to me. It doesn't seem like we need a national policy on this. Maybe the places that use it should have their own. But you talk about how the productivity has declined so much in the private sector. In the face of declining productivity, you would look for ways to save on labor, and that would mean things like automation. It would mean things like recruiting better staff that would have higher levels of productivity. Why don't we see that happening in transit?
Well, mainly because the federal law basically prohibits it. So when Congress began subsidizing public transit systems in 1964, remember they were taking over, these state and local governments were taking over the bankrupt private transit companies. Well, an important dynamic there was that these private transit companies were heavily unionized. And at the time, state and local governments generally forbid collective bargaining. At the time, only 2% of state and local government employees were allowed to collectively bargain. Otherwise, it was illegal. So the thinking was, well, we want to preserve, in order to get organized labor on board with this government takeover of transit, we need to preserve their collective bargaining rights in this transfer from private to public. And that's exactly what they did. They included, the law is called Section 13C. It remains on the books, and it basically requires transit agencies to never do anything that might upset a transit union. And how it works is there's specific requirements, but how it works is transit agencies have to certify annually in order to receive federal funds that they comply with these Section 13C kind of labor peace provisions. So think about it. If you're a transit agency and you want to automate a rail line, for instance, in order to do that, you either can procure that and then basically not enjoy any labor-saving benefits. You run the system as is. You have people sitting on the trains, even though they don't need to be. You pay them the same in order to avoid Section 13C claims, or you can pay them off up front in lump sum. You buy them off. The problem is that transit agencies basically operate on kind of an annual cash basis. They're dependent on annual appropriations. So there isn't a lot of money lying around for them to either pay off all these employees in order to gain these labor-saving technology benefits, or spend a lot of money on expensive capital equipment that you then can't enjoy the benefits from use. So there's really no incentive for agencies in the United States to adopt automation. Similar problem applies to competitive contracting. That's the dominant model outside the US. So if you go to Europe, you have a lot of, transit advocates in the US who like to praise the European approach to transit. And Europeans spend a lot of money on transit, but one different thing that they do from the US is they tend to procure these services through a tendering basis. So it's basically a public-private partnership, competitive contracting. They, in either operations or capital equipment or both, they partner with a private company. And then if that private company will then employ the workers who operate the system. But if that private company doesn't work out, well, they fire them and then they bring in a competitor. And that's something the competitive contracting model, while not explicitly prohibited by Section 13C, and neither is automation. It's not explicitly prohibited. It's just the barriers that law puts up makes it impractical for agencies to pursue these kinds of cost-saving strategies in a way that actually works, that actually reduces costs. So they don't do it. And that's basically it. There's a federal law that has been on the books that no longer serves its purpose. Those workers that the law meant to protect have long since retired, yet we're still stuck with this law.
And it's really a shame because automation isn't some futuristic technology. Like automated trains are very much possible and feasible and exist in other parts of the world, right?
Yeah, and including they're very common in the rest of the world, throughout Europe and Asia, and increasingly in Latin America, in developing countries in Asia. You're seeing automated rail lines spring up. We have dozens of examples. 2 decades ago, it was new technology. You had Vancouver being the big example then. Now it's increasingly the default when a transit agency or company outside the United States decides to build a new rail line, heavy rail line. It's most likely going to be fully automated. That's just how it's done now. But this is something that really doesn't. We have zero automated heavy rail lines in the United States. We have a light rail line in Honolulu that is, it's operating. It's partially built, but it is operating, and that is fully automated. So you can do new build. The problem is we really don't need, the problem is an existing service. We can't save money on that. And that's, I think, those are the kind of the trunk lines where you would expect these to be the highest productivity transit lines, the low hanging fruit, so to speak. We can't really do anything with those because that would, potentially involve, replacing employees with robots or negotiating more efficient labor contracts.
I'm tempted to look at the evidence that you provide in the paper and say, well, this is all a great point if you assume that the purpose of public transit is to move people. But part of me thinks that the real purpose of public transit is just to be a government jobs program, in which case it's working great. It is a government jobs program. Productivity doesn't matter in a jobs program. The whole point is to employ people. How much of it do you think is really just a difference in opinion about what the purpose of a transit system is?
I think that gets at a major problem with how transit is often approached in this country. It's sort of like it's something for everyone. It's a jobs program. It's a social assistance program for people who can't afford cars. It's a homeless shelter. It's all of these things. And because it lacks a clear focus, or policy lacks a clear focus, it doesn't really do any of those things well. Now, in my opinion, my view is that if transit is going to continue to exist and continue to receive public subsidies, it should be operated primarily for the benefit of people who cannot afford private transportation. So as a social assistance program, but for mobility, to actually provide a transportation service. And I think when you're prioritizing transit employees, who are often well paid, especially once they're senior, over the lowest income Americans who are dependent upon this service just to meet their daily needs, just to get to their jobs, just to get to medical appointments, I have a hard time believing you can really square that with the public interest. I think having it as a jobs program or as this grab bag, it's transit is something for everyone, really is highly regressive. And it hurts the people we should be trying, most hard to help through government assistance programs. So I hope that, and that's a point I think that often gets lost, but we really are doing a disservice to the lowest income Americans who have no other choice than to rely on public transit.
Another classic story of government intervention gone wrong. Thanks so much, Marc, for talking to us about it.
Thank you for having me, Dominic.
it can be fashionable for a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons to speak negatively about cheap goods. There are a lot of consumerist, anti-consumerist reasons. People believe that our culture is too accommodating of cheap stuff and that we should all buy less stuff and be happier that way. Certainly buying stuff does not make people happy, at least in the extreme. And there is plenty of consumerist excess that you can think of where people are probably not behaving super responsibly. But the problem comes in where you have to decide at some point what's a cheap good and what's a affordable good. Because you see, affordable is a very nice, positive word with lots of positive connotations. Things that are affordable are more beneficial to poor people. We want to help poor people. That's a good thing. But cheap can sound bad. But when you really think about it, cheap and affordable are really just two ways of saying the same thing. And it's actually important to defend cheap goods. Not because it makes everyone happy to have lots of cheap goods, but because it opens up a lot of thorny questions about who gets to decide what's a cheap good and what's a necessary one. Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent, while speaking at the Economic Club of New York, said that access to cheap goods is not the essence of the American dream. He said that the American dream is rooted in the concept that any citizen can achieve prosperity, upward mobility, and economic security. So sure, I don't think anybody would say that the essence, singular, of the American dream is access to cheap goods. I don't see it anywhere in the Constitution. I don't see it anywhere in the Declaration of Independence. But it is absolutely true that part of prosperity, upward mobility, and economic security means people having access to cheap goods. And the reason that this is the case is that cheap goods is another way of saying higher pay. Or, another way of thinking about it, people get the same benefits from access to cheap goods that they get from having higher pay. So how can that be the case? The key thing to remember about prices, one of the key things anyway, is that prices are ratios. Every price is a ratio. Every price is expressed with a numerator and a denominator. It's some amount of money for some amount of goods or services. So a lot of times that ratio is just implied. Right? If you go to the store and you look on the shelf, you just see the price and it doesn't look like a ratio, but the implied price or the implied ratio has a denominator of 1. It's saying that the price of something is, let's say, $2 for one box. So it's just implied, but it's still there. You know that if you took multiple boxes up to the cash register, they would charge you per box and not just $2 no matter how many you got. So you know the price is $2 per box. That's a ratio. $2 for one box. $2 divided by one box. A more obvious place it shows up is if you're at the grocery store and you buy produce and the price is per pound. You buy apples, let's say, for $3 per pound. That's a ratio. $3 for 1 pound. If you buy 2 pounds, it's $6. But the ratio is the same, 3 for 1. So, how do you make a ratio lower? If a price is a ratio and we want prices to be lower, how do you make a ratio lower? There's 2 ways to do that. One way is to reduce the numerator, reduce the number on the top. So you might put the apples on sale, $2 for 1 pound. That lowered the price. But it's just the same to lower the price by increasing the denominator. If you raise the denominator, you lower the price. So that box that I was saying before, that costs $2 for one box, if you raise the denominator and you say, actually, it's $2 for two boxes, that means the price just went down by 50% per box. Mathematically, it's exactly the same thing as a per unit price if the store said, actually, it's on sale for $1. On sale for $1 or two for $2 is the same thing. So this is true for every price. There's two ways to make it go down. There's also two ways to make it go up. We saw this during inflation. Sometimes the product would stay the same, but the price would just be a little bit higher. Other times, companies would have the price stay the same and the product get a little bit smaller. Either way, they're raising the price. It's just in the first case, they're doing it by lowering the numerator. In the second case, they're doing it by raising the numerator. And in the second case, they're doing it by lowering the denominator. So any price, there's two ways to change it. So let's get back to cheap goods now. Because there's another way you can express that price. The $3 for 1 pound of apples, that's a ratio. But you could also express that ratio as a portion of your weekly income. That's a more personalized price. That's the price to you for those apples. So let's say, for sake of argument, that you make $1,000 a week. If you make $1,000 a week, the price to you for those apples that week is $3 divided by $1,000. Now let's say you get a raise at work, and now you get paid $1,200 a week instead of $1,000. Those apples can be exactly the same price on the sticker at the grocery store, but they just got cheaper to you because your pay went up. Now it's only $3 divided by $1,200. That's less than $3 divided by $1,000. So you see what happened? The price went down for you, even if it didn't go down for everybody, because higher pay makes stuff cheaper for you. Well, it's the same thing if you just lower the price at the store. Both of these things are good, by the way. One's not better than the other. It's people like Besant that are forcing you to choose one or the other. To basically say, we're going to try to make pay higher, but we don't want goods to get cheaper. Or that they think goods will eventually get cheaper somehow once the enormous economic transition that they want to bring about through tariffs has taken place. Now, just like when other politicians talk about how they want to impose huge costs right now because we need to transition to green energy, and that in the future, once that transition's done, we will have way cheaper energy. But for right now, we just need to bear the cost. It's the same style of argument. I think in both cases, we should not trust politicians to be able to execute those kind of transitions, which involve quite literally millions of people in this country and, quite frankly, billions of people worldwide. They do not have the information that they could possibly need to manage that well. We've seen other countries in Europe that are much further along in the energy transition, places like Germany, where sometimes they can pay electricity prices 10 times higher than people do in the United States. There are still people that will tell you that it's worth it because in the long run, eventually, electricity will get cheaper in Germany. Maybe it will. But man, it's a lot of years of really high electricity prices with not a lot to show for it so far. So the trade argument is a similar one. We'll make stuff cheaper in the future, but for right now, you got to pay more. Because the government knows better than you how you should live your life. It's always an argument we should be skeptical of no matter how it shows up. But it's also one of the things that comes with this looking down on cheap goods. Because when you think of that price as a ratio of income, you can see how it really matters for poor people in a way that it doesn't for rich people. So an individual at the federal poverty line this year makes about $300 per week. About $300 per week is the federal poverty line for one person. If you have an imported good, one of these cheap goods from another country, let's even say it's China. If you have a cheap good that costs $3 less than a domestic alternative, and doesn't have to be food. Most of our food is grown here and consumed here anyway. But let's say it's a toy for a kid. Let's say there's a Chinese version of that toy that costs $3 less than an American version of that same toy, just for sake of argument. That $3 in savings for someone at the federal poverty line who just wants to do something nice for their kid is saving 1% of their weekly income. An entire percentage point of their weekly income is saved by access to this cheap good that still allows them to buy. Now, if you're a wealthier person making $3,000 a week, let's say, comes out to a little over $150,000 a year, well off, but not a millionaire. If you're making $3,000 a week, you don't really care about saving $3. $3 that's a 0.1% of your weekly income. Who cares? Doesn't matter to you. But it does matter to poor people. The people that want the upward mobility that Scott Bessent was talking about. It matters to them to have access to these cheap goods. Because in many cases, the alternative to a cheap good for a poor person is not a more expensive one. It's just not having anything at all. It's good for people to have choices. It is good to have a full line of a product, from a cheap version of it to a really fancy, expensive version of it. It's good to have both of those because then people can actually access it at every income scale. Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, talked about how the great achievement of capitalism is not in making better silk stockings for a queen. It's in making those silk stockings available to a factory girl. That is very much part of the American dream. The idea that products that were once only reserved for the richest people can now be purchased and enjoyed by people at the lowest part of our society. That's a good thing. It's a good thing for them. And it shouldn't be looked down upon by people who are, in many cases, extremely rich. People who don't have to worry about those trade-offs, don't have to worry about those choices. If they want to go out and buy the more expensive domestic version of things, that's good for them. More power to them. Go for it. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But let people who can't afford to do that buy the cheap stuff too. Because the government does not actually know best about how to arrange trading relationships, about how to decide which products are available, and trying to tell people that they should pay more for stuff because the government actually knows better is probably not a winning message. There's another myth that politicians will like to talk about, which is that there was this great golden age in the past when every worker had a pension. And then the greedy capitalists took away the pensions. And now everybody is out there fending for themselves to save for retirement. And they will die penniless. I'm exaggerating that a little bit, but only a little bit if you listen to some politicians. Bernie Sanders being one of them. Who talk about this issue. Organized labor will talk about it as well. But the defined benefit pension was this wonderful, amazing thing that existed back in the good old days when everybody had factory jobs, and now nobody has one because of greedy capitalism. Well, Andrew Biggs at the American Enterprise Institute wrote a really good article sort of knocking down this caricature of defined benefit pensions. You know, we've talked about this before on the show. We talked about with Thomas Savage back last year, specifically about pensions in the public sector, which is where they're mostly found today. But let's review a little bit about what we're talking about here. So a defined benefit pension is one where the payout that you get is promised ahead of time. So it says, subject to these conditions, subject to these contributions that you make, and subject to being enrolled in the program for a certain amount of time. It's called a vesting period. If you do that, the plan promises you that it will pay a certain amount of money to you when you retire. The alternative to this is a defined contribution plan. What that says is your employer agrees to contribute a certain amount of each of your paychecks to a retirement account. That retirement account, in many cases, you can choose to invest it however you want. And the final payout that you get is not predetermined in advance. The payout is determined by how well the investment fund does over the course of your life. So it might do better or worse depending on how the investments do. So it's a little bit riskier. But it has become more common than defined benefit pensions, which have almost completely disappeared in the private sector, and they really still only exist in the public sector. What's the reason for this? Again, it's tempting to say that, the greedy capitalists in the private sector took it away and the good benevolent government is keeping it going in the public sector, but that's not really what it is. As Andrew Biggs explains, it's really a result of common sense regulation. That said, you actually have to tell the truth about how your pension plan works, and you can't attach people to the pension plan forever, and you have to actually fund the commitments that you've made. Now, that might sound really basic. You actually have to put money behind the promises you're making to pay people in the future. But it was unfortunately very often the case that companies were not doing this in those supposedly good old days. Here's what Biggs wrote. He said, for instance, in 1971, the Senate Labor Committee analyzed 87 private pension plans, who since 1950 had 9.8 million combined participants. Of the 6.7 million plan participants who had separated from their employers, 88% did not receive even $1 of benefits. So let's hold on right there. Hold on. You're telling me 88% of these people did not receive any benefits. How could that be? They all had defined benefit pensions. The reason is that their pensions had vesting periods that lasted a really long time. Here's how that works. If you have a defined benefit that you know you have to pay out in the future, You need to raise a lot of money now in order to fund that. And you don't want to have to pay out that many people, because that makes your job in the present easier. So how do you reduce the number of people who will eventually be taking out from the fund? You say you only get to take out of the fund if you've put into the fund for a really, really long time. So you might have a vesting period that lasts 10, 15 years. So someone has to work at the company and pay into the fund for 10 or 15 years. Let's say it's 15 years. If they leave their job after 12 years, 12 years is a pretty long time to work for a company. If they leave their job after 12 years, they don't get anything. That's great if you're the pension fund, because that person put 12 years worth, a fraction of their paycheck in for 12 years, and you don't have to pay out anything. That's awesome. That's just a huge win for the pension fund. It's terrible for the worker, who basically just had, a little bit of their money from each paycheck stolen from them for 12 years. So one of the things that happened in 1974 is Congress passed a law called the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, or ERISA. One of the things it did is it said vesting periods have to be no longer than 7 years. It capped it at 7 years. Now, this is an arbitrary government rule, right? This is not the sort of thing that we would do in a completely free market system. There's nothing magical about the number 7. They could have done it at 5 years. They could have done it at 10 years, whatever. But Congress was responding to a very real problem, which was basically these funds misleading people, telling them that they had this defined benefit, but then saying, look, you have to stay in it for this really, really long time. And in the meantime, we're going to still take the money from you anyway. So it's kind of practice that led to this sort of rule. It's unfortunate that it had to be that way. A more defensible regulation from this on free market grounds, though, is that it required these pension funds to fully fund their commitments, and it subjected them to some federal oversight. Now, this isn't saying that, this is not telling the pension funds how they have to run their funds. It's not telling them what they can invest in. But it's just saying, look, if you're going to make these promises to people, you have to back them up with actual money. And you have to insure them so that when it comes time to pay out, you can actually pay out. Now, that is defensible on a purely free market system, because that's just government saying, protecting people from fraud. That is one of the roles of government in a market society. They're supposed to protect people from fraud. And what a lot of these pension plans were doing before ERISA is they were fraudulently telling people that they were going to pay them, and they had no way of actually paying them. And then when you get to the point you have to pay them, the fund turns around and goes to the government and asks for a bailout. And now the government's in a really weird spot, because it probably shouldn't be bailing out these funds for being irresponsible. They knew better, and they chose not to improve their practices. But at the same time, you've got a bunch of people who were promised benefits and are now retired and have banked their whole lives on those benefits being there. And so there is an argument to be made that, look, the government actually should do something about this, because these people were lied to. Now, if you're going to do that, it should come with putting the people who got the fund in that position in prison, probably, but that didn't usually happen either. So Congress said, look, we're going to subject these guys to oversight. We're going to make sure they're actually keeping their word. So it's not a coincidence that 1975, the year after ERISA passed, was the peak of defined benefit pensions in the United States. But even at the peak in 1975, only 39% of United States workers had access to a defined benefit pension. So it is not true. It was never true that everyone had access to a pension. At their most popular, 39% of people had access to one. And of those 39%, remember, That's just ones who had access. It doesn't mean they actually got any benefits. Because if they left and changed jobs before the vesting period was over, they didn't get any actual money for it. So it's not true that everyone, or even a majority of workers, had access to a defined benefit pension. And even at that high point in 1975, which is a very weird year to pick as the good old days, by the way, because there was a 1.5 year long recession that ended in 1975. Inflation rate was up around 9%, and the unemployment rate was up around 8%. These were not good times. But even at that time, 61% of American workers did not have a defined benefit pension. So why did these things disappear? Because of this oversight. Because you think all you were doing is requiring them to fully fund the system so they can just pull in some more money and shore it up and comply with the regulation. It'll be fine. Except in order to actually fully fund a pension, you basically make the pension really unattractive to workers. That's one of the things that Biggs points out. He says that if employers' costs for one benefit go up, they compensate by reducing wages or other benefits. So this regulation had the effect of raising the price of the defined benefit pension. And then workers were stuck in the situation where they said, wait a minute, I don't really want that much of my pay going towards this pension. I'd rather keep more of it now. And so that's how we get defined contribution plans becoming more popular. Because a defined contribution plan allows you to choose how you invest the money. So you can choose to invest it in a higher risk portfolio. That higher risk portfolio has a higher expected return. It also has a higher chance of losing money, but that's a risk that a lot of people are willing to take. In exchange for the guaranteed payout based on a much larger portion of your paycheck, people would rather set aside a smaller portion of their paycheck in the hopes of having a higher return and then ending up at basically the same amount of money when they retire. We know this is true because, as Biggs points out, employees generally invest about 70% of their retirement savings in stocks. He says that a stock-heavy 401k doesn't provide anything like a guaranteed benefit in retirement, but what it does provide is a higher expected rate of return, which translates to lower contributions from every paycheck. People are totally free right now to simulate a defined benefit pension. You could do it. You open a individual retirement account and you only invest in really, really low risk bonds. And you invest a larger portion of your paycheck in there because the low risk means you're going to have a lower return, but you can make up for that by just saving more money in principal. And you can do that, and you can basically guarantee what the value of that account will be when you retire. Because if you do it in really low risk bonds, the chances of that money, the chances of your savings disappearing or going down is very, very small. It's just that the return is also very small, so you need to put a lot of money in. You could do that right now. And that would simulate a ERISA-compliant defined benefit pension. But most people don't want to do that. Some people do, I'm sure, but most people don't. Because the cost is too high. It's not worth it to them. So that opens up the question, why do pensions still exist in the public sector then? Well, the reason for that is ERISA basically exempted public sector pension funds from its rules. So state governments and local governments are still allowed to make promises and not fully fund them. They're basically still allowed to lie to their employees. And it's much easier for them because they're already part of the government, so they don't have to go to the government and ask for bailouts. The government can just bail them out directly. And that's where we're headed with a lot of state and local pension funds. Again, go back and listen to that episode with Thomas Savage where we talked about that last year. So, Biggs writes that ERISA didn't make traditional pensions illegal. It simply said that if an employer is going to promise pension benefits, it has to actually fund them. Makes sense to me. I mean, that common sense rule spelled the end of private sector defined benefit pensions. That was good for workers who would no longer be lied to about their benefits, and good for taxpayers who would no longer be asked to bail out pension funds that were doomed to failure. Now it's time for the paper of the episode, but before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Marc pick the paper of the episode from the National Bureau of Economic Research in May 2003 by Ed Glazer and Matthew Kahn, Sprawl and Urban Growth. Here's Marc to tell you about it.
So there's a paper by Edward Glazer from Harvard and Matthew Kahn at the University of Southern California. And this is now more than 20 years old, but it's really interesting, and it challenges a dominant narrative in our discussion around urban policy. So commonly you hear in the popular press and among advocates that the reason why we have outward urban growth or sprawl is that the government subsidized it. They poured money into highways. They did all sorts of things to make the suburbs artificially more attractive to people. And if not for those government subsidies, we would all be living in compact 15-minute cities like we see in, these kind of idealized architecture renderings. But what they found is that while sprawl is ubiquitous and it's continuing to happen, the reason for its existence and its growth isn't government policy. It's not bad urban planning. Rather, it reflects a preference for car-based living that accompanies, growing affluence. A major benefit of suburban living is it allows people to afford more house. And a big advantage of having a car is it lets you access far more destinations than you could by other means. And so while I think there's a pretty clear logic to that. And once you start thinking about that, it makes a lot of sense. But it was interesting to see an academic economics treatment of this issue and finding contrary to the sometimes conventional wisdom. They also find that, sprawl is associated with growing quality of life. And I think what they point out, and this is something important, and this ties into other research, kind of in the theme of the spatial mismatch hypothesis. But basically what they say is the primary social problem associated with this type of development pattern with sprawl is that poorer people who can't afford cars don't have access to the benefits. And that's consistent going back, starting with some economists also at Harvard in the 1960s, looking at those changing development patterns, changing transportation patterns, and the folks who were being left behind.
Sprawl and Urban Growth by Glazer and Kahn. Read it. That's all for today. Remember that the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.